Pinkertons Ghosts is a horror anthology podcast by Superversive Radio, with no affiliation with any detective agency, person, real or imagined, or the dark forces of Outre Terre. It is not intended for children. Is a horror anthology podcast by Superversive Radio, with no affiliation with any detective agency, person, real or imagined, or the dark forces of Outre Terre. It is not intended for children.
This is Jim Donavan. The time is 5 p.m. It is a Sunday afternoon, and I'm sitting in my den with a glass of scotch in my favorite chair. That's right, I have a den now. I was richly rewarded by Oberon for helping free Kat the Leonanchi, which was pretty awesome, actually. I know Jack and probably Sean would have problems with taking money from the Fae, but as far as I see it, their money was going to be used for evil purposes, so by giving it to me, I can redeem their money and put it to good use. Right now, the greatest good involved renting a 3-bedroom house. That's right, house. In Encino. Not the best of areas, granted, but it's not dangerous, just kind of run down. It's like your favorite sweatshirt. It's got a few tears in places, maybe it's literally threadbare, but you love it, so you keep it around. Well, I haven't had the chance to love my new neighborhood yet, but by golly, I'm going to. The first thing I did was secure my garage from without and within against physical and supernatural forces. I then went to the storage room where I kept my brother John, hit him with a blast of the Verum Vicio that knocked him unconscious, and set him up in my new digs. He'll like it there. It's bigger than the storage yard, and unlike the yard, I was able to make sure it was protected against mortal theft. It's harder to create a protective barrier in a publicly owned facility. The Verum Vicio works not only in the present, but the past and the future, and when a place is new, it has no past, and the future is always in motion. However, in a house, like I now have, in a neighborhood that has seen like 100 years of life, there's been a couple generations of families that have been tied up in my current house. Not literally. Which allows the past and the future of the Verum Vicio to work stronger bonds on the present. In other words, with enough time and concentration, I'll be able to work some really weird magic here. Along with a new apartment, I upgraded to get an office along Ventura Boulevard. Fancy digs. I probably won't be able to afford it for more than a year or so, but man, that year will be so worth it. I even had a sign made. Jim Donavan, Detective of the Strange. Curses investigated, vampires slain, mansions warded. No sex stuff. I just opened up for the day for the very first time when I heard a light tapping on the door. Wasn't entirely sure I'd heard it correctly, but I did hear a masculine voice speaking in rushed Spanish, followed by a much louder knock on the door. The sign? Already worth it. I rushed to open and greet my first customers at this new location. I was greeted by a wizened old Latina who couldn't have reached 5 feet tall, even if her back wasn't hunched like a Cheeto. She was being supported by a slightly pudgy man, probably in his late 30s or early 40s. He had a somewhat thin mustache and wore a weathered cream cowboy hat in his head. She was wearing what I was sure was her funeral dress, and he was looking very uncomfortable in a pair of nice jeans and a long shirt, capped with a pair of very used cowboy boots. The older woman came in and started immediately speaking in rapid Spanish, and proceeded to straighten things in my office that I didn't even think were crooked. I don't speak Spanish. This is, admittedly, an impediment to doing business in Southern California. The man, seeing the look of strained politeness on my face, put his hand on the woman's shoulder, said a couple of words to her, and then said to me, You don't speak Spanish, do you, boss? He had a very faint accent and seemed totally comfortable switching between languages, so I'm guessing he'd either been born here or did enough business with Americans to speak English fluently. My name is Hector. This is my mother Maria, and we have a problem. My daughter has gone missing. I'm sorry to hear that, I empathized. I'm getting good at that lately. I've noticed that I give enough eye contact to make people feel uncomfortable, which means I'm giving the right amount, I think. I'm legally required to ask you, have you gone to the police yet? The man looked uncomfortable. No, we'd prefer not to attract Federali's attention. Kind of par for course here. Rather than say something snide, I instead asked, Okay, no problem. But can you tell me what happened? Does your daughter have any enemies, or do you? Maybe some trouble from south of the border? The cartel? No, I don't think so, senor. None of my family deals with those jackals. No, I think... At this point, the old woman blurted out, El Kakui. I looked to Hector and said, I'm sorry, what did she say? He rolled his eyes and said, My mother is convinced that some Mexican boogeyman stole Talia. Just a second. He turned to Maria and let out a string of rapid and heated Spanish, to which she responded in the same heated air, and eventually started smacking Hector on the shoulder. Hector gave up and turned back to me. Okay, look. I'll just tell you what my mother thinks happened, and I'll let you decide. We have a monster. It's, kind of just a scary blob, I guess you'd say. We call it the Coco, or El Kakui, depending on who you talk to. Anyway, this monster waits in bad children's bedrooms until they are asleep, and then it casts a magic spell on them to make their body stiff. If they wake up and see the Coco, it snatches the child up and takes them down to hell. I stared for a second. Okay, that escalated quickly. Instead of saying that, I tactfully said, never heard of it. The idea of a creature that steals bad children isn't super rare, but I'll tell you what, let me come to your house, I'll see what's what, and if I can do anything. Hector agreed and gave me the address. I promised that I'd show up first thing tomorrow. He and his mother left, looking a little relieved. I got out my little Rolodex. Look, this could have been a demon. There's a thing running around known as the Hat Man. Sleep paralysis demon. Very similar to my case from a couple years ago. I'm not saying that Kukui is the Hat Man, because I've never heard of him actually taking people away. Also, if the Kukui takes people away that see him, how did the legend spread? Sometimes folklore is stupid. I let my fingers do the walking and came up to my list of favorite informants. There are always deals to be made in the underworld, and kids run a high price. Ever since Oberon started bankrolling me, I've made some very lucrative contracts with some flesh peddlers. If I have a client come in soon enough, these guys let me have dibs on buying out whoever's on the auction block. It's kind of awful to admit, but sometimes it's a matter of reducing evil's harm rather than outright annihilating it everywhere it spreads. At least this way I can keep an eye on the sales that happen and alert clients to the possibility of rescuing their loved ones. In this case, though, I decided I'd bill the Pinkertons. Sorry, Control. This is probably the first you're hearing about it, but this is my excuse for my latest expense report. I'd gone through a few names on my list. No one had heard of a girl answering the name and details that Hector had left me. Finally, I got to a name that was highlighted on my list. Aaron Cohen. Good guy. Well, maybe not, but human. Barely. Who decided it was worth his immortal soul to sell children to the Outreterre. If I didn't need him alive, I'd keep his essence imprisoned in the Soul Stone while his spirit suffers eternally for his actions. I'm sentimental like that. Well, if I didn't need him alive long enough to solve this case. I'll be explicit, Control. I have a list, and he's on it. Might even be on the top if you'll believe it. It's just, how do I want to say it? It's not time to start working down the list. It's like pest extermination. If you don't get them all at once, the pests just get smarter. Sometimes, I like to imagine their screaming faces in the Soul Stone. Gives the scotch a nice, smooth flavor. Someday I'll have the power for that. Or it'll be a better place. The Paranormal Pinkerton reputation will soar. No one will cross me. Gus, I mean. Where was I? Oh yeah, right. Hey, Big C! I started my conversation as obnoxiously as possible. Who is this? Cohen had a whiny, nasally voice. He generally looked and acted like Jared from Subway, so I treated him accordingly. Hey man, don't be stunting! It's your main man, Jimmy D. Jimmy, who? Donavan? Come on, man, I can't be seen working for you. Now, Aaron, $5,000 is asking my favorite little stool pigeon for information. Not me. Little Mexican girl named Talia. $5,000? That's less than usual. Let me check if I got her. Maybe see who's selling her. Jeez. This guy. Look, I'll take the discount just to get this guy out of the game. Aaron does not rattle easily. Well, at least not by his job standards. He's going to be so disposable when I figure out how he gets this information. Why is this guy so special? I asked. He's mean. Sometimes he only delivers pieces of the merchandise rather than the full, product. Look, even I have standards, Jim. I paused for a second and said, "What is he, Aaron?" "I don't know. Some kind of fairy? They're pretty diverse. I don't think he's a demon or anything." "Do you have an address or something?" "I think he keeps a storage locker in Van Nuys." "Text me address, confirm the details, and I'll wire 5 G's into your Cayman Islands account." Kinda hoped whoever this creature was, he could compliment my informant. Aaron's nasally grinder of a voice just wouldn't sound great solo. Van Nuys is about 30 minutes to an hour drive, depending on traffic. Checked my phone, budgeted for an hour just in case. I loaded some supplies from the office. Shotgun shells loaded with cold iron rather than lead balls. A flashbang that tended to work on the upper registers of sound and the ultraviolet and infrared spectrums of light. See, the Fae have an impressive array of senses. They call those bands Jail and Ulfire, by the way. Lastly, I added a good broadsword that I'd ordered off Etsy. I've been taking some HEMA classes, and I felt pretty confident in my ability to fight anything that wasn't trained in medieval martial arts. But at this point, any halfway decent knight squire could eat my lunch. I called my contact for Oberon's court, wanted to make sure this one wasn't one of his guys. The contact was a snooty French elf who did not like me very much. He politely informed me that all Mesoamerican Fae were a member of Mab's court, not King Oberon's. Ugh, Mab is mean. Shakespeare did not do her justice with how horny and how cruel she really could be. Jim Butcher got closer. Suspiciously closer. I'm gonna have to write him a note. I asked if I could get some diplomatic immunity for icing a kakui. The contact paused on the other end of the line, as if he'd put me on hold, and another voice picked up. "James?" It was Oberon. Your Majesty?" "Do what you need to. I have no love for Mab's minions. You have the protection of the summer court behind you." "Yes, sir." "And James, make it hurt." "With pleasure." See, evil fairies aren't totally evil. It was currently winter in LA, which generally means that Queen Mab of the Winter Court of the Fae was exerting more power than not. There's some sort of biannual cycle where the various courts wax and wane in power. They're constantly at war with each other, with Earth as the battleground. I have no idea how this figures into the biblical cosmology, but it does tend to keep things kind of interesting. That Oberon was giving me permission to whack some pet of Mab's likely meant that he was making some sort of power play. I don't care. The affairs of monsters mean little to me until they start hurting someone. The drive to Van Nuys occurred in relative silence. Cohen texted me directions, and I pulled some impressive feats of handless driving while going 80 miles per hour on the 101. California freeways are not for the faint of heart. There's a storage yard in an isolated part of town. Both good and bad. Fewer witnesses and less collateral damage, but probably some sort of trap, too. Once I pulled off the freeway at my exit, I pulled into a shell station to consult the Soul Stone. I had a picture of her that Hector gave me. I could use the Verum-Vicio to locate her. A good picture's often worth more than 1,000 words, after all. I felt a spiritual tug coming from the same direction as the storage yard. I focused my eyes out of the Verum-Vicio so that I could drive safely. It's suicide to try and work magic while driving. I finished the drive and parked in the driveway. I walked up to the security booth. I saw a blood splatter that would make Jackson Pollock jealous. Popped my head in just in case, to confirm that, maybe the security guard wasn't actually dead. Yeah, let's just say he wouldn't be making it home for dinner. Blood and viscera were still dripping off the walls of the security shack, so that meant whatever had happened had just happened. There were odd tracks everywhere. I'm not an Indian guide or a Boy Scout, so I can't read tracks for anything. I had my shotgun out, my sword in a sheath across my back, and my grenades were in a fanny pack that I kept fastened around my waist. I never felt more like a badass. I had done some room-clearing drills with the newbies, so I felt pretty prepared for most surprises. Or rather, I was prepared for anything but what I actually saw. Around a row of storage units crawled 15 to 20 stuffed teddy bears, all with razor-sharp claws and fangs. I uttered a shocked profanity, and all of them turned towards me. The tallest bear, a polar bear, let out an ungodly high-pitched shriek, and half the bears started lunging at me, while the rest ran in the opposite direction. The lead unit was about 50 feet away, and they were closing distance fast. Not as fast as, say, Usain Bolt, but they were definitely moving about as fast as an angry terrier. I barely had to aim, they were clustered so closely together. With one deafening blast from my shotgun, I sent cold iron pellets hurtling through the air at speeds faster than sound. I don't know what these tiny terrors were, but they died as fast as any Fey did when hit with iron. They spewed pink arterial blood in geysers that belied their size. I don't think Newtonian physics can explain how so much pink fluid could be stored in such tiny vessels, but I do know that before I had fully expended my ammo, all 10 stuffies laid out with ooey-gooey entrails dangling behind them. The remaining bears panicked, as if they were real bears, and ran for the safety of the jungle of storage units. I quickly reloaded the shotgun, cramming 6 new shells in, hoping it would be enough. I was genuinely surprised I was able to take out 10 creatures with only 6 shells, but that luck wasn't likely to hold. I'd lost the element of surprise, so they'd be waiting for me. I rounded the corner of units that the remaining bears had fled down and began stalking my prey. They could have attacked me from anywhere. Above, from the sewer grates below, from a barely open storage space. They click-clacked on the roof above, and sometimes I heard one of their screeches. Sometimes they were answered. A single lone bear had gotten separated from the pack. It had neon green fur and was hiding in a dark corner, cowering from me. When I saw it and startled it, it leaped at me, a blur of green mixed with adorable fury. It had, however, misaimed its leap, and it sailed wide of my right side. I clubbed it with the butt of the shotgun, knocked it senseless. It was missing an eye. Perhaps the security guard had gotten a lucky shot off before he died. I decided to finish what he started, and stomped hard on the dazed creature. The same geyser-like explosion of pink, only this time it covered my lower legs. The thing was running so hot, steam came out of it with the blood. Ugh, right in the nose. When John and I were kids, we'd won a trip to Orlando, Florida to watch the filming of Family Feud. I'll never forget the smell of gack from that trip, and I will continue to not forget it, as the pink viscera of this adorable abomination reeked like gack. It also seemed to seep into my pants, and everywhere it touched, started itching something fierce. Okay, well, I was going to have to get a full-body CAT scan for the company insurance physical anyway. I continued down the corridor, this time shooting in these strays that I saw, not wanting to risk getting their disgusting guts all over me again, reloading after each shot, if it were safe. I ducked and weaved through the entire complex. I was getting dangerously low on my ammo by the last room. How many sidekicks did this creature have? I kicked open the last room and spun my shotgun to aim at a teddy bear's ritual. 10 teddy bears stood in a semicircle around a solitary, shadowy figure. Each bear was some sort of stretched out, horrifically thin simulacrum of a teddy bear that could only be called nightmarish. Each stood about 6 feet tall and were hunched over, as though their ungainly limbs caused them agonizing pain. Their heads were misshapen, as though they were a mailbox beaten with a baseball bat. They were all swaying in a loose sort of rhythm around the Shadow Man. He had an athame out. It was poised at the neck of a 13-year-old girl. It was Talia. She was frozen in some sort of pose, unnatural and likely meaningful for the ritual. Her eyes darted around, but her face and body were locked in some sort of rictus. In a voice that was equal parts rusty nail and existential horror, the beast said to me, "Drop your firearm, or I drop the child." I removed my right hand from the trigger mechanism and said, "Is this how the Winter Court handles things? Hiding behind children and teddy bear mimics?" The Kakui let out a gasping laugh and said, "It has been many a lonely eon since I have crossed blades with a mortal champion. Draw your steel and let me test your mettle." I dropped the shotgun and pulled the sword from its sheath. I struck a stance for my hemoclasses. The Kakui glitterated toward me and said, "Whoever survives walks away with the girl." And over his shoulder he called out, "Walks away unmolested." I gritted my teeth as I watched as the semicircle of waif-thin teddy bears enclosed the two of us in a makeshift combat ring. They started chanting in voices that were simultaneously low and yet high at the same time. With my eyes focused on the Kukui, I shouted out to Talia, "They'll be okay, Talia. Your dad sent me to get you. Won't let them harm you."
"Don't make promises you can't,"
the Kukui started before I lunged out with my sword, sweeping from his lower left up toward his navel. The Kukui leaped back and parried his blade down to intercept my cut. He shot out a riposte straight to my core, faster than I think I would have been able to see had I not been training. As it was, I barely dodged out of the way, running into a teddy bear, who pushed me back into the circle.
"That was deceptive, mortal. I approve."
He grabbed his athame with one hand and ripped it out of the hilt until it molded into a sword longer than mine. It had a waved blade from hilt to tip. Where my blade was a standard broadsword made of Damascus steel — cold iron is always just work steel after all — his appeared to be a sort of long, curved bone. Maybe a elephant tusk that had been pared down to shape and hardened in some eldritch magics. It collided with my sword, and I felt a deeply resonant sting afflict my fingers that chilled its way to my very core. He struck with the speed and accuracy of a viper, and I could tell it was toying with me, having taken my measure in the first few seconds. As I suspected, against an experienced foe, it was all I could do to parry. I couldn't even get the space to counterattack. The Kukui came at me with a two-handed overhead blow, which I managed to sidestep and just parry in the right way, so the blade cut into one of the Stretch Armstrong teddy bears. It didn't just geyser blood, it exploded, like a dam had burst. Because I had parried the Kukui into it, the explosion covered my entire back, but it doused his front. He was covered head to toe in gacky-smelling sludge. He'd covered his face with his arm just in time, but while his vision was obstructed, I had an opening. He had hit my blade with such force that it ripped it out of my hands, so in the seconds of dead space that I had, I reached into my fanny pack and drew out one of my special, custom-made for Fae, flashbangs. I pulled the pin. The Fae have senses akin to dogs and cats, and so I tweaked up an explosion that was only damaging to those frequencies. I pulled the pin and chucked it at the Kukui's face, just as his arm was pulling away from his eyes. With a motion faster than thought, he swatted the grenade out of the sky, and it triggered the explosion early. I heard nothing, and felt at worst a breeze, but the resulting shock wave flattened the teddy bear's picnic in eruptions of pink fluid that spewed forth from caverns unnatural to man or fae. I watched as the Kukui's eyeballs, until this moment only a shadowy afterimage on his shadowy, indefinable form, burst from their sockets, and he collapsed to his knees and moaned. I picked up my sword and delivered a fatal blow through his stomach. Even among the Fae, there are basic rules of biology that must be observed, and a cold iron blade piercing the bowels is both unpleasant and incurable. I had to obey Oberon's last request to me, after all. I watched as the Kukui slowly, painfully, bled out and died. Its shadowy pink blood spread over the entire floor, corner to corner. When the pumping of blood finally stopped, the spell on Talia was broken. She was a wreck, understandably. I delivered her to her father an hour later. I was covered over 3/4 of my body in pink goo, but his daughter was utterly unharmed. I gave him the number of one of the few contacts in the church that still speaks to me, and told him that Talia had some trauma she'd need to work out. He slipped me an envelope full of $100 bills. Didn't bother to count it. I shook his hand, pocketed the money, and left. I'd have done it for free, but I wouldn't insult a man who was going to pay me. Besides, I was going to put it into a high-interest trust fund that would become available.
Pinkerton's Ghosts is a podcast distributed by Superversive Radio, licensed under an attribution non-commercial, share-alike international license. This episode was written by Ken Dickerson and performed by the same. Ben Wheeler edits, directs, produces, and herds cats. Ken Dickerson performs our audio editing. Visit us on Facebook, read articles on superversivesf.com, or listen to us on unauthorized Acast, iTunes, or Spotify. Contact us through Twitter at @PinkertonsGhosts, email us at pinkertonsghosts@gmail.com, or send us noble messenger possums with messages strapped to their backs. Don't worry, they know how to find us. Thank you for listening, and good luck.